Hello, everyone. We're going to be starting here just in a couple minutes. We still have a few people joining us, so I'm giving it another minute or so, and then good evening, good morning. We're here to talk a little bit more about DevOps. In particular, we're here to talk about application instrumentation using application insights. Before we get started, a little bit about myself and Wintellect. My name is John Garland. I'm a technical VP and instructor at Wintellect. By virtue of the fact that you all are here, hopefully you guys know a little bit about us, but you may be only familiar with us from one of the things that we do. We actually have several core areas that we work in. We offer a consulting practice focused on software application development and architecture. We have instructor-led training, and we've been Microsoft's #1 training vendor for over 15 years. We've trained many thousand Microsoft developers. And we have an on-demand training video service, subscription-based online video service. Additionally, you all may know us primarily from our work in .NET or Windows, but we actually can help you with our expertise in a lot of other areas like cloud, DevOps, data and artificial intelligence, and mobile development as well. Myself, I'm an Azure MVP, certified trainer. I've been heavily involved in Azure, primarily the platform as a service and development stack, for probably a little bit over 6 years at this point. Let's see. Some of you all may know us from our work in the software development industry. We've written a lot of books and other publications, myself as well. I've written a couple and done a bunch of tech editing on several others. Before we get started, I wanted to let everybody here know there are some special offers for people who are attending this webinar today. In particular, we're offering a 10% discount on any public virtual Microsoft Online courses. You can see our catalog at wintellect.com/mock. We're also offering a discount on training related to the new Microsoft role-based certifications. Beyond that, we do have a app dev or cloud briefing or Q&A session that you can schedule with us. So if you've got a project that you're looking to get off the ground or have some questions you want to ask, you can go ahead and schedule that. We're offering discounted exam vouchers for the new role-based certifications, and also a discount for private on-site training from our training catalog. If you're interested in any of these offers, please reach out to Martha Guerin, and she'll be able to follow up with you. I'll show this slide once more at the end of the presentation in case you need to jot down addresses or what have you. So to get things started here, as organizations embrace this DevOps culture, there is a bit of a common cycle to be adopted in order to go after the goal of providing this continuous delivery and value to end users that's at the heart of DevOps. We've seen this cycle really in a lot of other methodologies. DevOps just aims to make a bit of a tighter loop than maybe we've seen elsewhere and involve more of the people in the organization in the process. It starts with the idea of planning your objectives, figuring out what you're going to do and how about how long you think it's going to take, how you're going to get there. And from there, it drives into development and testing, generally punctuated, culminated with some kind of a continuous integration process or continuous integration tools and techniques and technologies. From there, you'll release the product, you're relying usually on some kind of continuous delivery tools. And you know, again, it may be through various different rings of release or feature flagged releases or what have you, but there's some kind of an automated, repeatable release strategy involved. And then what? You know, how do you objectively connect your product release to making your choices about goals and objectives for the next thing in the business? In some organizations, it's the loudest voice in the room that's making these decisions for you, or whoever's got the best or funniest or most poignant customer anecdote. Yeah, I knew a customer who this happened to. We need to do that in this release, or who wants this. But a lot of subjective factors kind of go into that bridge between release and planning. One of the most important things you can bring into that particular cycle is this idea of monitoring and actually learning from your application, being objective and not subjective about what's driving the next decision, the next most important priority in the application. And you know, so why is monitoring so important? And at the risk of being a little cynical here, if you're relying on your customers or your coworkers to tell you what's going on with your product, what needs to change, what needs to be improved, what needs to be added in your product, and you're singularly relying on their goodwill to inform you properly of that, you're probably making a bit of a mistake. There are a lot of factors that come into getting noise from those, or getting information from that group of people. You know, we've all seen this. People who have bad experiences with a website, with a product, well, sometimes they will scream bloody murder about the fact that their tables aren't properly aligned. You know, just small cosmetic things will get blown out of proportion. And sometimes a big thing like a crash or some data loss, well, they may not be very vocal about it. They just may not have the time or be in the mood to share their particular experience. And in particular, sometimes if they're working on a website and you're offering a service and they're using that service and it fails for some reason, they may not even bother to report to you that it failed. They may just outright leave and never let you know what exactly happened, what drove them away. And of course, we've all seen the circumstance where when they do report to you that something went wrong, it can be a little bit cryptic sometimes. You know, I was trying to do something and now it's busted. I'm going to need a little bit more than that to go on in order to figure out how to fix this. Another aspect is when people have good experiences, they don't necessarily give you feedback on that. For those of us who live in warmer or in colder climates this particular time of year, a lot of us got into a car this morning, started it up, turned on the heater, and drove to work. And if we got to work and the heater worked, I don't think a whole lot of us sat down and composed an email to our car manufacturer and said, you know, dear Honda, thank you very much for giving me a working heater. It was supposed to work. It worked. We're not going to bring it up. Our time is too valuable to spend all our day, you know, talking about the trivial in that case. It was supposed to work, and it did. But when things go wrong, people can be very vocal about it. When things go right, it can be a little bit muted, and that proportionality sometimes isn't quite understood in order to decide where you're going to spend your precious resources going forward in your project. And the other aspect is our employees, our colleagues, our coworkers. Well, we talked about the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes they've got personalities that can either accentuate or mute the feedback they have to offer the process. They may have a buddy who had an issue with the site and they'll bring it in, and now it'll be weighted disproportionately. Or again, at the risk of being cynical, sometimes, you know, there may be someone in sales who comes in and, you know, thinks they can drive a sale by adding a particular feature of the application in a particular area of the application, but it may be a part of the application that only that one customer really ever uses, and adding that isn't necessarily the most important thing to do right now. So what do we do about this? Well, the key thing here is letting the application tell us what's going on with the application. Get that objective data, get that telemetry, figure out what happened, just as important, what didn't happen, and what went wrong and what went right, and weigh those things appropriately and have actual information in order to base those decisions on. So this brings us to the concept of monitoring in Azure. Now, Azure provides several different tools under this emerging monitoring umbrella, and they build on top of a couple of technologies that allow us to store and manage logging and metric information. Logging is rich data, contextual data. Metrics is going to be more point in time. This many things happened in this particular time interval. It's a little bit more discrete. But these data stores are fed from sources at different levels in your Azure in your Azure product. You can get data from your Azure Active Directory tenant, who's logging in, how are they using these things. You can get information about the subscription, about what resources are being added or removed or interacted with. Information from the resources themselves about how they're being used. What, each resource may offer different kinds of telemetry information. The operating systems, if you're using virtual machines, may provide feedback about what's going on in the OS and what's the capacity, how well is it being used, how fully or partially is it being utilized. And all the way up to your application may emit information specific to that application about how it's being used. And the ability to gather and look at the data from your application is really what we're going to focus on in this particular talk today. So the feature in Azure monitoring that allows us to get information from an application is appropriately named Application Insights. And really, it's an application performance management service that focuses on three key areas. It gives you tools and SDKs in order to help you get information about your application's behavior. It then allows aggregating this behavior data, and it presents it in ways that help you understand what your app is and isn't doing. And also, it'll integrate with other tools both in Azure and outside of Azure in order to surface this information in a way that's meaningful and actionable. And an important note here, we talk about Azure Application Insights and the Azure monitoring stack. Although these are services in Azure and exclusive to Azure, there is no on-premises version of the monitoring data stores and the tools that interact with them directly. Application Insights can be used to aggregate data from on-premises applications. You can use the SDK that it provides directly from your application, or you can also get automated telemetry by installing what's called the Status Monitor agent into your on-premise application. So if you've got an application or a system that's strictly on-premises or hybrid on-premises and running in Azure, you can include that telemetry from that application into an Azure Application Insights repository and then use the features it provides to get that broad understanding of what is going on with the application. Now, all that being said, it's great to talk about Application Insights, and we could show slides all day here about it. But really, the best way to understand it is to see it in use and see some of the capabilities that it can provide for monitoring and troubleshooting and understanding what's going on with your applications. So with that, I'm going to hop over to a bit of a test application here at this URL, and this can be as interactive as all of y'all would like it to be, by certainly seeing if what you think of this test little application that we have. And I'm going to go ahead and bring it on up here. And okay, so we've got my fantastic shiny side up motorcycle parts store here. We happen to be running our big annual custom exhaust sale, and it's just a kind of a variation on a typical e-commerce application. There's the ability to go ahead and register an account with the application. You can sign into it. Let me see. Go ahead and sign on in. And I don't want to bother with that. I can see the various parts that we happen to be selling. I can add them to my cart. I can then go ahead and remove them from my cart. Oops, yeah, that didn't work so good. I can log out. I can continue to look at the parts even if I'm not logged in. I can add them to the cart. And, oh, okay. So our site clearly has a couple of problems that we probably need to deal with and get a better understanding of what's going on here. So the first thing we'll want to do is we'll want to add and instrument the site in Application Insights. The site is up here in Azure. It's just a simple Azure web application. Bring it up here in the Azure portal. Now, one of the things I'm going to do is there's two ways that you can instrument an application using Application Insights. You can do a build, it's sometimes known as a build time and runtime instrumentation. Build time and runtime instrumentation. I consider them kind of an outside in and an inside out options. You can add the instrumentation onto the running site by providing that agent that I mentioned ago or configuring it here in Azure. Or you can go ahead in Visual Studio and add the the Application Insights SDK into the code and publish the instrumented code. My recommendation is you want to do both. If you're in a crisis, if you're firefighting, just turn it on the running site and don't bother rebuilding your app until you have an opportunity to do so. But generally, instrument in both places and you'll get the richest set of data. The runtime, the application's already running, it's built, you don't want to change it. It'll give you full dependency details. It'll give you more detailed exceptions if you have that turned on. But if you want to get an API for logging custom telemetry, if you want to include trace logs, trace statements in your telemetry, or if you want to include page view information from the page as it's running in the browser, you're going to want to instrument it inside of the built client. So like I said, you'll want to do both. To do the one on the web application, just here from the web app, I can come on over here to the Application Insights blade, and I can turn on the site extension for Application Insights. I can choose which resource I want to connect my data to or create a new Application Insights resource as part of this. And I can choose the language my application is written in and select the features that are available for that particular language, whether it be collecting rich performance profile information, the snapshot debugger that allows us to obtain runtime information of our running application, basically get the call stack and the state of the memory of the application, the local variables at the time that a particular event happens. That particular event usually is an exception has happened. A few other things can drive that, and we'll go over them a little bit more throughout the conversation today. And other detailed information. If I apply this, it will go ahead and install the extension to my web app, and my web app will be instrumented. Again, this is the outside-in view. I've already done that to the running web application in the interest of time, but I'll come down here to Visual Studio, and we will see our the code for the application here in Visual Studio. In order to add the Application Insights instrumentation, we can come over here to Connected Services and choose Add a Connected Service. Like a lot of things in Visual Studio, there's 3 or 4 different ways you can do this. You can also select this little Application Insights node up here in the toolbar and add Application Insights, or I can right-click and select Add Application Insights Telemetry. I like the Connected Service myself. Your mileage may vary. But I can select Monitoring with Application Insights, and then I'll go ahead and click on Get Started. And it's going to want me to sign into an Azure subscription. This is a little feisty. I am signed in, but sometimes it makes me sign in a few times. There we go. So I'm signed in, and rather than create a new resource, I'm going to deploy my telemetry to an existing Application Insights resource that I already have configured. Again, it's just a little bit faster. There's a little less to create. And of course, just make sure I don't drive the scroll bar there. So as it mentions, getting started is going to make some changes to our code. We'll go ahead and take a look at what those are. Before I get started with making those changes, though, I wanted to point out this is just strictly an ASP.NET MVC application. You've got your controllers. I've got a little bit of dependency injection going here. I've got my contexts that interact with Azure storage in order to work with the tables where I keep my parts. It uses ASP.NET identity and a SQL database in order to manage the account information. It's really a very vanilla application at this point. Coming back to configuring application insights, I'll go ahead and click on register. And this will go ahead and make some changes to my application to tie it into application insights to bring the SDK to allow it to emit that information. And this usually just takes a few seconds here. And we're all set. So it's added the SDK, it's registered the app with application insights, it's added some configuration here. Let's take a look at what it's done in order to understand what's going on here. And this is where it's kind of nice working with an application that's already in source control. I can see what changes were made by that particular step. Looking at the project file, I see that it's added a couple of resource ID elements to my project. In particular, it's added this application insights resource ID and annotation resource ID. These actually tie in Visual Studio into application insights. It allows Code Lens, which is a feature in the Visual Studio Professional and higher SKUs that allows displaying of information about code inside of your browser, various pieces of information about your application inside your browser. I'll show that here in a minute. There's also this annotations, which when we publish our resource to Azure, we'll go ahead and drop a mark into into application insights that lets it know when the app has been updated inside of Azure. So we can now track and identify, oh, I made a change, I went ahead and published something, and now I'm seeing exceptions or information. I can correlate telemetry to the fact that the application has been updated and maybe see if I've improved or broken things along the way. We tie in a package, a NuGet package for application insights. And in fact, this is a fairly older one. One of the things you'll want to do is come on up and manage your NuGet packages and update that one. It's about, I believe, the 2.1 version is about a little bit over a year old. So you want to go ahead and update to a later version of that. And of course, accept. And then while I'm in the neighborhood, I'm going to add one more package reference, and that's to this snapshot collector. And this is useful for .NET applications. This is the thing I was talking about a minute ago, where it allows, when certain key events happen, gathering a snapshot of the state of your application as it is running in order to help debug and identify information. This happens by default in application insights when your application gets an unhandled exception. It also happens, you can connect Visual Studio and trigger this to happen on demand for yourself as well. Okay, now that I've got the NuGet packages up and ready, let's take a look at what else has been updated inside our application. Let's get rid of that. So one of the other things we can see is it's added a content into our settings file, into our app settings.json. I recommend removing this from your local code and going ahead and adding this key into your deployment environment. And the reason I say that is when I'm running this, when I'm debugging locally against my code here, I don't want the telemetry that this thing is generating to go ahead and be merged into the telemetry into the environment that I'm deploying to. When I'm developing on my desktop, I'm doing all kinds of horrible things with the application, and it will skew the telemetry of what's going on up there and what I'm observing inside of the application insights instance. So I will generally remove this for the sake of our conversation today. I'm just going to go ahead and take this instrumentation key value and mask it so it doesn't get picked up by the application insights SDK for us. But you'll notice up in the configuration settings for our web application, we will have that as a setting in the application. So when it runs up here, it will go ahead and pick up that value and connect properly to our application insights instance. You'll see it's, the instrumentation key is right here. And where does that instrumentation key come from? It comes from our application insights resource, and you'll see it here on the overview panel listed under the instrumentation key. Like I said, we're going to go ahead and just remove that from our local debug though. Another change that was made is the program CS was modified, and an extension method is being called to inject application insights into the application. And this uses the Application Insights SDK to latch on to the ASP.NET core processing pipeline, inject itself into there, and start gathering information about requests and other events as they're fielded inside of the application. The last or near last thing I wanted to show is it's also modified my core layout file, and it's inserting some JavaScript into that file. This JavaScript actually is what collects telemetry inside of the browser pages as they're running and reports back how long did the page take to load, are there any exceptions happening in the page. You can actually use the Application Insights JavaScript SDK to provide additional telemetry information as well. But it basically gives you that instrumentation, so you're not only getting it on the server, you're also getting it on the client. The last thing I need to do here is I need to go into my startup. When you're using the snapshot collector, there is some boilerplate that you have to include in ASP.NET Core MVC applications. In ASP.NET proper or ASP.NET Classic applications, it just goes ahead and includes this as part of the configuration file. And properly injects things there. But in ASP.NET Core, there is this bunch of boilerplate code that you do need to include that provides and injects the snapshot collector into the telemetry processing pipeline. And this is all available up in the documentation, up in Azure, related to App Insights and the snapshot collector. The settings are, there's a variety of settings you can modify for snapshot collection. I've got the defaults highlighted here. The big thing is, some of the big ones are, an exception has to happen more than once in order to generate a snapshot for it. So we don't want to generate snapshots for every random thing. A maximum, for the same problem, we're only going to gather a few snapshots over a particular instance of time. Just a bunch of things to optimize and manage the performance of this particular tool. That's all well and good. The other thing is, if I wanted to go ahead and collect some telemetry, I could come over here, or custom telemetry, into my, actually I'm going to do it inside of my cart context. And I will do something like, let's see, when I get, when I add an item to a cart, let's go ahead and log some telemetry about that. So I can create an instance of the new telemetry client. The telemetry client is the Application Insights entry point into their SDK for reporting telemetry. And I've got a bunch of methods here, like for items I can track, like trace statements, availability, dependencies. I can do custom exception tracking or custom metrics, individual requests, whatever it is that I want to report to App Insights. So in this case, I'm just going to do a simple track trace. It's a bit redundant because it's also already instrumenting my tracing pipeline, but I'll go ahead and do this anyway. And I want to say I'm adding item to cart. We'll go ahead and use some pretty formatting here, and part dot name. Okay. So now we're going to be tracking that whenever somebody adds this. It's important telemetry. We've got to have it in our application. I'll just build this to make sure it builds okay. Normally, I would also give this a local debug, but we're going to go ahead and push this on up into Azure right now and work on it from there. So going ahead and publishing this on up. And this just takes a moment. And okay. and wait for this to come on up. Now, as this is coming up, I'm actually going to split this out and do a little bit of some split screen fun here so that we can see what's going on. I'm going to bring up my web application and hop over to App Insights. You don't have to do it this way, but I just want to show that this is one of the ways I can get from here to there. And I'm going to bring up my live metrics stream. And this is one view that Application Insights provides for your application. Clearly, I've got to work on my responsive layout for this application. But as I interact with my application, this will give me a real-time view of the requests that are coming through. You can see I've got one request there. Let's go back home, get another request going. And maybe I can go and bring up a part and add it to the cart, and you'll see I've got a failure that should be showing up. So this gives me kind of a real-time hook the patient up to the electrodes and see what's going on with the application. Bring this back over to here and slide on over. And you also get some telemetry information that's displayed. And just again, this is a what's going on right now. It's fairly transient. What you'll end up doing that is looking at short-term things. Longer term, you're going to look at some of the other stuff that we'll be showing you here in just a second. The other aspect of the telemetry here that I want to bring up is this application map. And this is interesting because it's actually looking at your application and how your application is being used, who's calling it, and who does your application call. And it's got the intelligence to understand some calls are being made to Azure Table Storage, some calls are being made to SQL database, in this case for authentication. And it'll give you a quick view of what's going on in your application. I happen to like this view, so I'm going to go ahead and pin this view to my Azure dashboard. And if I come on back to my dashboard and stretch this out a bit, give it a second to catch up, you'll see I've got the nice view of my application and a bit of a summary of its health being displayed here for me. In addition, when I come over here and look at the overview blade that's available in the Application Insights instance, I can see a variety of different metrics that it's already gathering for me. Failed requests are kind of interesting, server response time, number of server requests. Let's go ahead and take a look at those. I've pinned those to the dashboard as well, and with a little bit of resizing magic here, I'll go ahead and bring that up and find this one over here off to the side, resize it, and commit that change. And now I can see at a view when I come to my Azure portal some critical information about the health of my application. Note here that I've got a failed request. Let me dig in and find out what's going on with that particular request failure. This takes me to the failures view of the application. And here I see a bit of a chart showing over the last 24 hours. I can change that particular time span. What's going on with my application from a failure standpoint? I've got a few failures that happened at 9 o'clock yesterday, some that happened earlier today. I've got these little markers here. These actually are those annotations that I mentioned that describe when my application was being published. So again, if there's a correlation between publishing your app and errors, it becomes visually evident here. This lower graph here is the number of requests. I can go ahead and change that. But looking at errors based on requests, I can see if my requests spike and my errors spike as well, I may have a load handling problem to deal with. And down here, I can just see an overall view of what are some of the errors. And I know that I've got a problem with adding an item to the cart. So if I click on it, it'll thin out this view over here to the right, and it'll show, okay, I've got about 15 or so errors over the last day that are null reference exceptions, 500 errors. Let's dig into this and find out what's going on. Clicking on Take Action will list those 15 items for me. And the suggested item is one that it's kind of representative of the issues that all the others represent, or the most representative. I can click on it, and it's going to take me to this nice Gantt view that shows me the timeline of what happened that led to that particular exception. I can see the request up here first, and all the telemetry that's being automatically gathered about that request. What URL it went to, what was the response code, where was the request made from? In this case, it was made from my home here in Cumming, Georgia. And again, additional information about the request. I can see the call stack at the time that it happened. I can thin it out to just my code. It says cart context line 62. Let me see what's going on in cart context line 62. Now, something, not quite sure what's going to cause me a null reference exception there. Let's go back and dig a little bit further. The other thing I'll notice is that I've got this little mark, this debug snapshot mark here next to my telemetry, and it's telling me that it actually captured a debug snapshot for that particular error. And if I open that snapshot, it should just take a minute or so. By the way, I can also download that snapshot and open it directly in Visual Studio, and it will line up to the files and the stack and everything else in Visual Studio. But just looking at it here in Azure, I can see, okay, again, that I had that particular problem at line 53 in cart context. Okay, what is line 53? Okay, of course, I've changed. This snapshot was taken earlier before I moved my lines of code, one thing to keep an eye out for. But I'll notice that my user is null, my operation, my cart entity is null. Could there be a problem if user was null? Sure enough, user is dereferenced without checking it being null first. I now know where that exception is because it basically took me back to the line of code where that particular exception happened. And this is without me having to really do anything other than add a couple of NuGet packages and turn on a flag in the Azure web application. And by the way, this isn't strictly Azure web applications. It will work for virtual machines. It will work for Service Fabric. It'll work for a variety of different deployment models that you may have with your application. Okay, so knowing that, I could go in, I could make the appropriate fix to the application to keep that from happening, and go ahead and move on and deal with other issues in the application. Sorry, the other thing I wanted to be sure I showed here was with this request. One of the problems that we can run into every so often is, well, I still don't know exactly what went wrong. I'd like to get some more insight into that. And I've got options down here that let me look at this in a bunch of different ways. I can click on this show a user flow, and I can see that this user started an operation several times, went to home. It just gives me a flow view of what the user did visually in my application and what pages they got to that led to those particular problems. I can show this request over time, the timeline for this request. So I can see, again, this is, you ask the question, okay, what did the user do? Well, in this case, they went to the home page, they got the detail, they went to the part detail, they tried to post it, and they got an error. I can get this detailed information rather than asking or relying on the user or trying to contact the user. I can see what they've done. And I can also look for the telemetry that was in this user's browser session. And this will take me actually to the Application Insights search window, already tuned in to try and find that particular user session. And I can see, okay, these are the calls that were made in that particular session. I can see I've got the exception, and then I'm back to the telemetry view. So you get these rich it's not just gathering the data, it's providing rich correlations of this data to help you take action to troubleshoot the problems. Coming back from the failures blade, we've also got the performance blade, which lets me see, okay, what's going on with my application from a performance standpoint. I can see here the average time for all of my calls. Maybe I want to move up to the 95th percentile to get rid of any outliers. Sure enough, login takes a while, and adding an item to a cart takes a while. And I can see information about how long is that taking. I can drill into the same type of Gantt chart. It's very similar to the failures view, but it gives me a detailed view of performance in my application. Another one I want to call out for here is the availability area. With availability, I can add availability tests. And in this case, I'm going to create a test, and I'm going to call it demo availability. And I'm going to choose a URL ping test. And what that means is I'm going to give this test a URL to go to in order to see, is your application there? Is your application responding? I can choose whether or not to parse dependent requests. What that means is when I load a page, if I'm going after an endpoint that's a web page, maybe I need to parse that and load associated images and pull down other things that are related, other links that are related in that page. And I can, I'll be generous and I'll give it a few retries just in case something weird is happening. I run this test every 5 minutes. I can choose the locations that I'm coming from. So in this case, it's automatically chosen 5 locations in the United States to choose from. We have another site that we monitor that gets used heavily from the United States and from Asia Pacific. So we've gone ahead and set up 2 of these tests, one to monitor from US and one to monitor from APAC, and get to see if the availability gets hindered in any one of those locations. I can define my success criteria. In this case, I'm going to say the test has to complete inside of 120 seconds. It's got to return a 200 HTTP code, HTTP response, and I can even match the content if I knew what that was going to be. Drop the page content in here and say it has to check against that. Then, well, what happens if I fail? I can go ahead and say, well, if it fails at more than 3 out of 5 locations inside of a 5-minute window, go ahead and send an email alert to all of the subscription admins. And with that, I can just create the test. By the way, it doesn't have to be an email. It can be something, you can actually trigger additional actions, deal with webhooks, talk to logic apps, trigger a variety, and maybe your logic app can fire a text message off to you. You can do a variety of different things in order to signal the application. And we'll see here, I've actually had this running. I turned it off a little bit prior to the demo, but I've had this availability test running, and for the most part, my application is doing well. I can see I had a little bit of a glitch from South Central US. This happened sometime last night, and I can get details on what happened there. And it looks like it was just an intermittent hiccup, nothing to worry about tremendously. But at this point, Application Insights is going to notify me that my site is down before my users start to notify me that my site is down, which is just tremendously valuable. Okay, so beyond the, as I click around here, the monitoring aspect of things, beyond the telemetry aspect, I also want to talk about the usage aspect of the application. This section down here, if you scroll beyond the investigation section and into usage, I can see information about what's going on with my application. Again, over a time range. In this case, I want page views over the last 24 hours, grouped by an hour. And let's take a look, bring up some more insights. And I can see I've had 6 users originating from the United States, 1 from Canada. 6 are using Windows 10, 1 is using something else. And we're getting browsers that include Edge, Chrome, Firefox, and maybe a few other random browsers. In fact, I can even split my chart to reflect things based on browser. And I can start to get an idea of what's going on with my application. How is it being used? Another site that I work on, I had someone ask me today, I've got this feature, I want to include some functionality that doesn't work on IE. Well, let's take a look. Well, 2% of your users have been using IE over the last 30 days. At that point, they felt they could go ahead and just say, you know what, we can mark this as non-functional for IE and go ahead with the implementation. But I can get objective information right here about who's using what browser on my site and when. I can do the same thing for, instead of just users, I can group it by sessions. I can also look at funnels. And what is a funnel? A funnel allows me to define a series of actions that I'm interested in. I want to know the users who went to the home page and then from there went to the login page. And I can see that 6 users came to the home page, and from there only 2 proceeded to the login page. It gives me an idea of what people are really doing and not doing with my application. I showed the user flows a little bit earlier, coming at it from the exceptions page. Retention won't show up too well here because I don't have a lot of users on the site over a large period of time. But the idea with this one is to gauge Are people coming back to my site? What is the retention? How am I able to stick users to continue to use my site? And then impact is a fun one. I like to call it the settle a bet page, because what it allows you to do is it allows you to define an action, in this case, the home page. And how long did the home page take to load? Some piece of telemetry about that page. Let's just look at the duration on it. And let's see how much it affects the usage of looking at part details, or does it at all. The idea here being, you will get people who say, well, these login page takes so long to load that users aren't going to the next page after that, or the parts catalog takes so long to load that nobody's bothering to order any parts. And I can go ahead and actually look here and say, okay, how does the duration of this page affect the fact that people are going and using this other page? And in this case, it's deciding, you know what, there is really no correlation here. It's a nice little bit of interpretation of the telemetry that it's doing to help us get additional insights into what's going on with the application. One of the next things I want to call out here is all this is well and good. And it's great that the Application Insights team has been providing all of this great information and insight into my application and continues to innovate and provide new ways for me to look at my application. But I may have a very specific thing that I'm looking for, and it's not provided for me out of the box in these solutions. As I mentioned before, all of these are built on top of the log analytics data storage that is provided, or that is part of Azure. And along with that, the rich rich querying capabilities into that data that's been made available is also available to us in Application Insights. I can actually look at this chart here, my failed request count, and I can open it in View and Analytics. Anywhere you see this little puzzle box here allows you to jump into the analytics view. And we'll see what that is here in a second. I'm interested in the failed request count. Let's take a look at that. And this is going to hop me over into the analytics environment. And it actually is, here's the query that's used to drive that particular chart. I can see that it's been built up. Let me see if I can slide this down just a little bit, see more of it. I can see that it's doing a variety of things with the data. It's ultimately, it renders it into a chart. The data it's acting on is in these tables that are defined over here. So I can see from my requests, here's the telemetry that's been gathered, and the telemetry I can go ahead and query. I can create my own queries. So I can do something like requests where client state or province is equal to and Georgia. So let's run that. And my fantastic, very important query. I can see here are all the requests where over the last 24 hours where the client originated in the state of Georgia. You can do certainly a lot more than that. You can save these queries out. I'm going to retrieve a bit of a contrived saved query that I have over here. In this case, I'm going to look at my requests where they're either gets or posts, where they're not synthetic source. A synthetic source is one that is a request that includes a header that indicates it's for testing, like those availability tests. They actually will contain a header that say this isn't a real request. It's a synthetic request. I'm going to translate my operation name a little bit. So my just get plain, I'll translate to home index so I can know for sure that my my default route is going to home. And then I'm going to count the number of requests and the duration of that request for some strange reason. And in fact, if I run this, I can see, okay, the home page had the most requests, and 42 requests for a total duration of 55 seconds. And detail had a few more and what have you. But I can also very quickly render this as a chart instead of just as a table. And I can get this handy correlated view of request duration and request quantity. Beyond that, I can actually click on the pin button here and select my dashboard. And if I come on back here to the dashboard view and I refresh it, I will see that my new custom query is available for me over here in my dashboard view. So fairly handy, fairly useful. Okay. Let's see what I want to make sure I cover here next. Visual Studio, I wanted to make sure I covered that. That's all that I'm going to cover in the Azure portal right now. I talked about Code Lens. We know we've got a bunch of problems adding an item to a cart, and if I look here in either in professional or beyond versions of Visual Studio, I can see that in my live environment, I've got 7 exceptions. And in my debug, because I haven't run this, I don't have any exceptions being carried out here. If I run this application from within Visual Studio, and give it just a second here. And wait for Visual Studio to come up here. And click on something, cause a bug. Okay, come back home. If I come back to Visual Studio, I will see in my debug view, it's actually generating Application Insights telemetry. It's indicating it's unconfigured. It's not going to an endpoint because I changed that value there at the very beginning, that Application Insights key. But it's actually reporting it inside of the debug session. And if I click on this little Application Insights button up here, I can actually bring up in Visual Studio viewer of the Application Insights telemetry. And if I look over the last 30 minutes and browse on it, these are the requests that were made. I get a view that's very similar to what I was seeing in the portal that gives me the information about what was going on inside of my debug session. So it just gives me richer debugging information than I normally would get. Not only that, but I can tell it, you know what, instead of just looking at Visual Studio, look at what's available for me up in Azure. Okay. Let's come back to the slides here because we're running into the end of our time together. What's the price for all of this? That all looks great, but how much is this going to cost me? The basic price for Application Insights is free, up to 1 GB of telemetry data a month. And well, how close do you get? Well, one of the things you can do with the application, with the portal inside of Azure, I knew there was one more thing I wanted to show, is if I come down here to usage and estimated costs, I can see on the current month how much data have I gathered and what's my cost looking like for that particular amount of data gathered. Above that 1 GB, I pay $2.30 per gigabyte. I get all the performance management and analytics features that I showed. Data is retained for 90 days, period. There is no way to modify that right now. If you need to hold your data for longer, you can enable continuous export, which will allow you to take the data that's being gathered in the tables and send them off into blob storage, and then you can use your own tools to analyze and interact with that data. You can work with log analytics with this as well to get a holistic view of what's going on with your entire system. And I mentioned that URL test. There is one other test option there. You can actually provide a more detailed set of instructions using a Visual Studio test script. But to run those tests will cost you $10 per month. Additionally, you can go ahead and include caps on daily use. You can configure sampling and filtering on the incoming data. So you can do things to manage the data that's coming in for you. A few resources to make available for folks. I don't know if you want to screenshot these links or we can figure out ways to get them to you all. Whoopsie. But just various useful resources. The documentation for Application Insights is actually pretty good. There were several build sessions this past year dedicated to Application Insights and monitoring. The query language that I showed in analytics is fully documented, and there's even a cheat sheet for those of us who are more familiar with SQL to go ahead and get develop our queries or translate our queries from a SQL to the Kusto language. There's detailed information about the snapshot debugger. There's a lot that can be done with that. And there's actually a REST API for the Application Insights. I mentioned earlier the offer that Wintellect has, the various discounts that attendees of this webinar can go ahead and subscribe to or take advantage of. If you're interested in any of these, please contact Martha Guerin at the email address below. And with that, open up for any last minute questions. It looks like we've got about 2 or 3 minutes left here.
John, there's some questions in the window.
Oh, okay. Is that in the questions window or in the chat?
Questions.
Ah, there it is. Sorry, I'm struggling to use the tool here. Maybe if I pop it out. There we go. Sorry, I just need to figure out how to resize it. Does GDPR or any other information collecting and monitoring rules or guidelines require you to add disclaimers to the application that actions are being monitored or tracked? Good question. GDPR does make us be very tuned into what data we're collecting on our users. And to be honest with you, I haven't seen any guidance in the Azure documentation about this for one way or the other. Because we are tracking potentially IP addresses, and IP addresses are considered personal information under GDPR, you very well may want to or need to provide a disclaimer or information that you are gathering that. And it is being disposed of completely after 90 days. So it is not being held for long term. And if you gather custom telemetry, then yes, absolutely, if you're going to be gathering anything that falls under the GDPR personal data rules. Will this work for Xamarin Forms? The answer is kind of yes. For Xamarin and for mobile applications, it's more recommended to use the Application Center, and that data can be bridged into application insights, but you certainly could take this and plug in the SDK. It's like a lot of things in Azure, the SDK is just REST calls, so you could technically leverage things that way and make calls and provide the telemetry there. The Automagic stuff obviously isn't there for the mobile applications. You would largely have to gather the data and decide what you wanted to send. Is App Insights in the government portal? Alfred, good question. I do not believe yet that it is in Azure Gov. Azure Gov tends to lag behind the public cloud a little bit, and I believe this is. I think I've seen it on the resources that it is being included at some point in the not too distant future, but no, it is not there currently that I know of. Is it possible to have the graphs display in real time outside of the Azure portal? Well, one of the options for doing that would be the fact that this data can be consumed externally, either through export, or you can actually connect to it through Power BI. So you can use Power BI to display the information there. Can you tell me the options to use any tracking tool in on-premises environments? So again, this is one that you technically could use on-premise, although the data does have to live in cloud. Otherwise, you may be looking at tools, and I don't know for sure which ones of these have on-premise offerings, but tools like Dynatrace or New Relic or SolarWinds may offer an on-premise specific environment. I'm pretty sure Dynatrace offers an on-premise specific environment that you can use. Is there a cost for App Insights over the Azure hosting cost for the site? Again, I showed you, let me come back to a slide a little bit. Depending on how much telemetry you gather above the 1 gigabyte that's free, there may be a cost. Depending on your multi-step web tests, there may be a cost there. And if you export the data, continuous export, there's a storage cost for whatever that data is wherever that data is being stored. I don't see a whole lot of other questions. With that, again, please don't forget our Wintellect offers here. And please feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions or if we can help you with any of your .NET, cloud, or otherwise needs. And thank you all for being here today.